Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program and Membership Director, and I'd like to welcome you to this information session about the League's Deborah Norden Fund, featuring presentations of two projects by past travel grant winners, as well as some basic application information, which will be provided by Zoe Fruchter, the League's Program Manager, along with the opportunity for a Q&A session with the winners, League staff, and Linda Norden, the sister of Deborah Norden, who co-created the award and has served as a juror since the first year of the prize. Linda, who will open today's program, is a curator, author, and educator. She also specializes in, as she refers to them, startup positions, including helping to develop the curatorial study program at Bard, followed by other curatorial roles at what was then Harvard's Fogg Art Gallery, now the Harvard Art Museums, where she was the first curator of contemporary art, and she also helped to create the CERT Gallery there, then at CUNY's Graduate Center Gallery in the old Altman's building on Fifth Avenue, where she directed their program and gallery from 2008 to 2010. She's taught in the MFA departments of Columbia, Yale, Hunter, the Malmö College of Art Academy in Sweden, and most recently at Cornell, both in Ithaca and down here in New York City at Architecture and Planning Space downtown. She's now an independent curator and writer, actively involved in a small nonprofit in LA and working with the development of a Kunsthal in upstate Hudson Valley, New York. Linda.
Hi, thank you so much, Anne, and all of you, Amanda, Jacob, Zoe, Benedict, and Damasi, for inviting me. I'm thrilled that we can do this last round of the Deborah J. Norden Fund. It's been unbelievably gratifying to be in a position to support architects in the making, young architects, somewhere between student and, as my sister used to say, getting on the grant train, to realize projects, early projects, but primarily to get to a place, a community, a site, an actual architectural construct, to experience it in real space. The fund was created 30 some years ago, just 30 years ago. My sister was killed tragically in an airplane crash, returning from a trip to hear the architect Faye Jones, on whom she was writing a book at the time, in person. And her husband, she'd been married only a few years at the time, when he received money from the insurance for that flight, decided he needed to do something with it that would be meaningful to my sister. His name is Barry Magid. He's a psychoanalyst. He appreciated the more traditional aspects of my sister's architecture, but we enlisted Rosalie Ginevro, who was then president of the League, and Anne Van Ingen, who was my sister's boss. She had worked for many years at NISCA, supporting architectural proposals herself, to create a kind of group jury. Rosalie structured the prize, organized it, and over the years, many different people at the League helped to realize the grant. And as you all know, that's a tremendous amount of work, fielding many applications, early on printing them. But what was an effort to honor my sister's two primary concerns, the first being to get to a place to actually experience, as I said, some architectural detail or the compound or the work, and a community and a context and all of the real surrounds. And in particular, to support housing, which may be less evident in the grants that were given over the years, but that was my sister's commitment. She wanted to steer talent, architectural talent, away from trophy architecture, away from corporate architecture, to housing, and particularly site-sensitive housing. She was a real people person. And being able to jury and administer this grant has made me realize that grants are actually often about real people who are interested in other real people and real projects. So I was asked to talk about the jurying process, and to sort of cut to that. Each year what we did, and I was amazed at how many grants we'd receive each year. It was hugely gratifying and evidence of the need for support of exploratory projects like this. The process was a very straightforward one. We would read everything, and there were many. There were often as many as 200 grant proposals, sometimes more. We would winnow down to a short list, and that short list, the overlap in the short list would be shared on the day that we met. We would read these in advance. On the day that we met for the jury, the days that we jury together were always incredibly gratifying, and we would almost always invite one other person, or sometimes two young architects or other architects to help. Rosalie would usually choose those individuals, and everybody would read everything again. And then for the first time, we would read recommendations. And what was most effective, we did respond to visuals. We were looking for projects that made the case for the travel, for actually being there. We were looking for projects that did original work, which Rosalie and the invited guests were usually in a better position to judge than either Barry, myself, or Anne Beningen. And I should add that my son, Luke Joyner, whose life, who was 7 when my sister died and decided to be an architect because of her, and now then jettisoned architecture, studied urban design at CUNY, and teaches and has been in a department. He was hired to help create a little department within the department at the University of Chicago, focused on architectural drawing and specifically urban topology and aspects of urban design. He has also participated in he had participated in the committee in years past and will again this year. His name's Luke Joyner. But the things that really mattered on the proposals were clarity. As always, with a grant proposal, you want to make vivid, you want to make alive the thing that excites you. And then we were really interested in, I think some of us more than others, the politics, not the politics, but the sense of commitment to a real community, and awareness of what an architectural work was in its place, but also just the real need to be there. And a case for how that particular travel and architecture would mean to you as an architecture in development, where it fits, what the travel grant would do specifically to support that, and maybe what you would do with it. Nothing was required to be submitted after the fact. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but we heavily encouraged people to not just report, but to document in some way what they had done. And the recommendations mattered, I have to say. They were often the deciding factor. Again, we were looking for just, it didn't have to be all 3, but we needed to know that somebody had a sense of who you were and what you were capable of doing, and could make that evident in writing. And as somebody who's taught for years and writes endless recommendations, I know how hard that is to do. But it is definitely worth getting someone whom you feel really gets you and the project. I just wanted to say that my sister juried because she worked for the New York State Council on the Arts. A huge part of what she did was traveling around New York State, meeting people, looking at sites or projects or organizations, and then presenting to the New York State Council of the Arts, on the Arts, I always forget, and presenting. So we were also inspired by her process. I think that's pretty much it, but I'm going to hang around for Q&A if anyone has questions that are more specific.
Which is just so great. We so appreciate you being here. And now on to the people that Linda was referring to. We have two different projects represented here. I'm going to introduce them both so that the presentation runs more smoothly. The first speaker will be Amanda Coen, who will present her project Inhotim Contemporary Ruralities, which considered the case of cultural institutions in rural development by looking at the Inhotim Art Center in a remote region in Brazil. Amanda, a 2019 award recipient, is a landscape architect, researcher, and educator. She's currently based in Montevideo, Uruguay, where she runs a small studio that works collaboratively with local and global organizations and to shift regional approaches to conservation and land management. She leads a landscape design studio at the Universidad ORT in Uruguay, and she's also a doctoral candidate. Her research focuses on extractive land practices. Next up will be Benedict Clouette, a 2012 award recipient with Marlisa Weiss. He will discuss their project, Forms of Aid, the Architecture of Humanitarian Space in Nairobi, Kenya. Their research focused on slum upgrading project in the settlement of Kibera, undertaken by the government of Kenya in cooperation with UN Habitat, and situated that project in relationship to other sites across the city. Both Marlisa and Benedict are founding partners of Interval Projects, an architecture and urbanism practice based in New York City. They are the authors of Forms of Aid, Architecture of Humanitarian Space, which expands on their Norden report and also includes case studies in Port-au-Prince and the West Bank. And their work and writing have been published in a number of publications, including the New York Times, Domus, Volume, and the Architect's Newspaper. Benedict is a doctoral candidate in architectural history and theory at Columbia University GCEP. You're detecting a theme here, I think, of where people are in their careers when they get this prize. His research currently focuses on image cultures of 20th century urban design and architecture and the use of surveys and mapping and techniques in large-scale projects. And Wise, who could not be with us today, is the director of architecture for the New York City Parks and Recreation Department. So, Amanda.
Thank you. And thanks for the introduction, Linda. That was great. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Is it showing up? Good to go. Okay. I received the 2019 Deborah J. Norden Fund and did the travel in early 2020. So right before the pandemic, I was very lucky with the timing. I think, to give some context, my inspiration for the project really came from three things. One being my upbringing. I grew up in upstate New York in a very rural part of the state, and was surrounded by this mix of rural and urban worlds as I moved between there and my grandparents in Manhattan, as well as a very local and global upbringing with a mother who was in international development and agriculture, and a father as a large animal veterinarian. And I was really interested in the accompanying cultural overlays that go along with these very practical demands in more rural settings. The second influence was really working at Snøhetta post-grad school. I did a Master of Landscape Architecture at UVA. And then I was at Snøhetta for 3.5 years, working on a lot of projects that mediated between culture institutions and local communities. And then thirdly, alongside the work at Snøhetta, I carried on my own independent research that was very much focused on landscape systems, their cultural nuances and regenerative approaches. So my project really formed around the idea of contemporary ruralities, which for me was this idea that rural realities are often increasingly dominated by resource extraction processes, large-scale infrastructure projects, and high-tech agricultural practices that are necessary to fuel growing urban populations. While such industries have existed throughout time, advances in transportation, communication, and digital technologies have increased the intensity and scale at which they operate and shifted ecological, economic, and political relations on a global scale. They offer sources of employment to local communities and are dramatically restructuring the rural landscape in the 21st century. I was interested in working within the context of this sort of landscape, but really looking at alternative models to rural development. So my research questions were mainly, what are the benefits and risks of embedding internationally recognized world-class cultural institutions in rural settings? What is their relationship to the local community? And can they offer an alternative model for how rural areas might develop? Inhotim became a really great sort of case study for this. It's a contemporary art center nestled in a mining region in Brazil that mixes landscape architecture, ecology, art, and architecture. As I mentioned, it's located in the state of Minas Gerais, which is I flew from Rio to Belo Horizonte and then would take the bus to Brumadinho, where I stayed. And it's in between the Atlantic rainforest and the Brazilian savanna, and very rich in iron ore. So there was a lot of mining in the region and a lot of sort of extractive practices. Right before I wrote the grant, there had been a really horrible dam that had collapsed and caused a lot of, like 5 miles of toxic sludge that just devastated the landscape, and over 150 people had died. So I was going also in a context where the art center itself was trying to figure out what role they were going to play in the community in a moment that was very tense and sensitive. There's also a huge Afro-Brazilian population in this region, which became a very important aspect of the programming at the art center. And one of the key contacts that I made before my trip, which helped a ton, was a Bronx-based artist named John Ahern, who was actually one of the first artists to install his work in Inhotim in 2006 when it opened. He was very insistent on having his base be within the community and then bringing the art to Inhotim rather than sort of working in this closed off bubble. So I think having him as an intro to the project, he gave me books that I wasn't able to find anywhere else and really helped me connect with people at the art center before going, was key to the project. So the art center itself is about 4 kilometers from the center of the town. And my day-to-day was spent, usually I went for about 3 weeks, and half the time was spent at the art center and half the time was spent more in the town and the surrounding landscapes. I stayed in town. I thought it was really important to get a sense for the local community, which is really what I was interested in as much as the art center. And so I found an Airbnb with a mining family. There were very few options. And stayed with them, which was also incredible to have a totally different viewpoint. I would walk every day to Inhotim and arrive to this sort of oasis haven world very far apart from the realities of the town. Day to day was filled with field observations, interviews, and research. I really had a chance to interview everyone from the curatorial director to a local community member who was bringing the music program that summer. And then the Uber driver who became my go-to and everyday companion on larger journeys further afield from Inhotim as well. So Inhotim is about 350 acres are open to the public, so it was a huge space to explore. Most people that go as a tourist spend a few days. So being able to spend several weeks there was great. They were very generous and gave me a space in the educational center to look at primary documents, helped to take me around the site. And there's about 23 pavilions that are nestled in the landscape. So I went around to all the different pavilions and took a time to sort of be immersed in them, sketch, observe, try to understand what their relationship was to the surrounding region as well. And really, I think a lot of these installations provided a critical lens on what was happening around them in a somewhat much safer environment where they were able to do that. For me, the botanical collection and the staff that was working towards that were really key to linking back to the community. So this is the director of the botanical garden who was really using Inhotim as a laboratory to then expand beyond the walls of Inhotim with some of the projects they were doing, which also really involved post the dam collapse disaster, really working with the community as well. Another important component was the employment that Inhotim offered. So just within the botanic department, there was a huge amount of maintenance to upkeep the grounds. There was a whole research arm dedicated to botanical studies. They have one of the largest collections in South America. And then it was also really interesting just to see the canteen and sort of the behind the scenes of day-to-day where people went when they worked there. They had an excellent medical and dental program for employees, which was really unheard of in sort of mining jobs and other industries in town. It was the second largest employer in town behind the mining industry. And then again, the outreach that I mentioned. So this was a program that they had with a group of local farmers who were starting up a farm, and the Inhotim would consult with them to help them implement mid-sized agroforestry organic production practices. And then the community itself, after the dam had collapsed, they opened the doors and decided that anyone that lived in town could come for free. So you would start to see sort of community members using the artwork in their own sort of appropriated ways, especially on hot days, which was really nice and interesting to see that dynamic. The post trip, I finished in March 2020 and ended up being stuck in Uruguay, where I decided to stay. But I think the main takeaways, I ended up publishing an article in Landscape Architecture magazine and did a report for the Architecture League, and have since used a lot of the lessons learned while there, both spatially in design practice, and then also just thinking about how to guide my own decisions and where I go professionally. But I think overall the Art Center, in terms of its relationship to the community, it really, I think Lucas, who's the director of the Botanical Garden, summed it up really nicely. If you're in a safe place with beautiful interactions and encouragement, you feel you can fly, so you fly, you go further. But if you've been told you're not responsible for your own life, you're not able to do that, you're not able to do this, then why will you flourish? And so I think on a sort of softer scale of the impact, I think Inhotim really provided a space for local youth to come and see other ways of interacting with the landscape and understand that there are other opportunities in terms of employment and just thinking about their future. I think the relationship between the Institute and the town was pretty fraught, and a lot of the older generation still saw it as a bit of an intrusion to their town, partly because of the history of how the land had been bought in the settlement. It was owned by a mining magnate. And I think with the next generation, there's a lot of programming and ways that the institution is trying to reach out to the community and trying to make people feel more welcome. So I think it's a lot of the sort of impact we'll be seeing probably in the next generation. But the town itself also could take advantage of having an institution like this that draws a lot of people from afar. There were very few restaurants or places to stay in the town. So just sort of more infrastructure for the tourism so that the effects of the Institute could spread beyond, I think, is another real main takeaway from this. And then post Norden, as I mentioned, my plan was after Norden to come to Uruguay for a week, and I ended up getting trapped and stayed. And I have now been operating from here and with a mix of professional practice. I work on select projects with an office called Wilding by Y in New York and 10 by 10 in Minneapolis. And then I also have my own practice here that's a mix of work with NGOs and more traditional landscape architecture projects, research and interdisciplinary collaborations, which have led to me deciding to pursue a doctorate here, looking at extractive land practices. And then teaching, I think here it's especially important in the context of this region of the world to sort of expand the opportunities for landscape architects. I think it's a field that's very much evolving still. So it's been really interesting to sort of be embedded in a place where the field doesn't quite exist as it does in the US and figure out ways to connect to people here and learn also from what they have here. So some of the projects that I've been involved with that have been really meaningful are a group of archaeologists here that are looking at indigenous landscapes, and specifically these mounds that are now embedded within industrial scale rice production fields. So they're very much in danger and disappearing, and there's this group of archaeologists and anthropologists are working with landless people to sort of, the government leases them land, and they're working with them to come up with management plans for how to work with these mounds and preserve them, but also use them in responsible ways. Another project is ongoing, and it's working on a small vineyard project to instill regenerative practices and also tell the story of a Uruguayan French poet that lived here and embedding that in the landscape in really sort of light touch ways. And then finally, I think one of the most meaningful, larger scale projects here has been with an NGO called AMBA, who's very much promoting getting people outdoors and promoting rural tourism. Uruguay is an extremely rural country. Much of the rural landscape's dominated by agriculture and forestry. And so their work is really important in terms of thinking of alternative uses for the land and alternative ways of engaging with it. So there's been a variety of projects with them, from master plans to more punctual work. And I will stop there because I think I've reached my limit, but I really wanted to thank Linda and the Norden family for the experience. I think it was, for me, unexpectedly life-changing in terms of where I've ended up geographically. But also, I think really, I mentioned growing up in upstate New York, and one of the things for me that was really meaningful growing up in a rural place was the New York Foundation for Arts sent photographers out to our school to work with us. And for me, it was one of those moments where you see the impact that having sort of that creative outlet, that creative vision in a place where otherwise, I think many people probably don't have access to those sorts of opportunities. It really meant a lot and changed probably the direction I took. So thank you.
Yes, hi, Benedict, Clouette. Thanks so much to the Arc League for inviting us to share our work on the project that was funded by the League. Slides. Yes, so thanks for the invitation from Anne and also to Linda and the Norden family for the grant. It was a absolutely transformative experience for our project. So as Anne mentioned, it was a joint collaboration with Marlisa Wise, with whom I direct the Architecture and Urbanism Practice Interval projects. And it initially came out of a year-long independent study when we were students at GSAP in the MArch program with Felicity Scott. And that we were then able to develop through funding from the Norden Fund in this particular part of the project, which focused on Nairobi. So it was the Nairobi research was one component of this larger project, Forms of Aid, which was eventually developed as a book, and which focused on the architectural and urban consequences of humanitarian operations in 3 sites: Port-au-Prince, Haiti, after the earthquake, the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Nairobi. And so the focus of the research was the way that architecture pressed into the service of an idea of a universal humanity often abets more subtle complicities that attending to the urban consequences of humanitarian operations can help to draw out between international NGOs, national philanthropies, corporate responsibility programs, and supranational organizations like the UN or the WHO. And so our interest was in the spatial consequences or this urban products of these humanitarian operations that were, understood to be not in service of humanity itself, but actually in the interests of very specific organizations, infrastructures, legal codes and technologies that articulate some idea of the humanitarian in these specific sites. So, as architects, it was really the spaces of humanitarian operations, the materials, the sites and structures that interested us. And so the research in Nairobi focused on a series of sites throughout the city centered on the construction of a new housing estate on the outskirts of this informal settlement, Kibera, which is, sometimes seen as a sort of model slum, you could say, and is used to some extent as a kind of laboratory for the slum upgrading program operations of the UN, which has the African headquarters of the UN is on the outskirts of the city in Gigiri. And so this is the KENSUP, the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program housing being constructed adjacent to Kibera. But we also looked at relationships between these sites and others in the city, including this industrial processing zone and the informal settlement of Mukuru adjacent to it. So the project began when we were still MArch students, actually, and we were part of a group from GSAP that was invited by the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation to participate in this Building Back Better conference in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and after the earthquake. And out of that, we were able to sort of fund additional trips to Haiti in working with Columbia GSAP and Parsons also on studios. And through that experience, sort of slowly pivoted almost as a way of processing that from, doing work within these circuits of aid workers working on urban issues in the context of disaster relief in Haiti towards a more critical examination of those structures and practices. And that's sort of where the idea of this as a book project originated. When we were still students, this is an image of a UN guard tower on the perimeter wall of an export processing zone, so a kind of factory zone with preferential tax codes applied to it in Port-au-Prince. So it was out of that we developed this idea of the book, which we then developed as an independent study with Felicity Scott in our last year at GSAP as MArch students. These are some images of the manuscript from that phase of the project. And we used that as the basis for applying initially upon graduation to the Kinney Fund, this graduation award that is given by GSAP in order to travel to the second of the three sites that form the case studies of the book, the West Bank. This is an image of one of the concrete shelters that replaced the original tents in the Dheisheh refugee camp in the West Bank. And then finally, with the Deborah Norden Fund, which was really like the first source of actually external funding for the project. The first round of in Port-au-Prince had been funded through work as effectively aid workers with a particular technical expertise. The second was through our school and this graduation award. But the Norden Fund really allowed us to, and this is so critical because it allowed us to complete this multi-site study that was without which the book couldn't have happened in Kenya. This images of the roofs of the Kibera settlement and this bypass road being constructed at that time. And then this is the KENSUP housing on the other side of that bypass road from the informal settlement. And an image of the Médecins Sans Frontières compound within Kibera and the UN Habitat post on the sort of at the entrance to this main road that has been built through Kibera as part of the slum upgrading program project. So some of the themes of the research that I just wanted to touch on very briefly. So humanitarian government, in Nairobi, we examined the urbanism that results from the relationship between international humanitarian operations with local and national interests, considering this KENSUP slum upgrading project as a form of humanitarian government, which is a term developed by the anthropologist Didier Fassin to describe the way that this idea of humanitarian government is that it works not only across national borders, in many different countries around the world, but also on the boundaries between state and non-state formations, between this kind of universal moral imperative of the humanitarian and the particular highly localized political conflicts. And so the result is a form of international humanitarian order sustained through the coordinated activities of NGOs with national and local governments, like in the example of, this is some of that KENSUP housing under construction when we visited Nairobi in 2012. So the coordinated efforts of NGOs, local governments, supranational organizations, and often, not only multinational corporations, but even sort of military and security operations. Another of the themes that we were developing through the research, this idea of the extraterritorial status of humanitarian spaces. So the best known examples of extraterritoriality in humanitarian operations, you could think of these as like the land parcels where the 4 UN headquarters are built. This is a picture from our research of the UN headquarters in Gigiri, Nigeria, in Gigiri, Nairobi. And so, the land of the UN headquarters in New York or in Nairobi is geographically located in the city, but legally has extraterritorial status under international law. But extraterritoriality of humanitarianism is not only limited to the land parcels occupied by these diplomatic organizations, but in Nairobi, for example, the growth of the Makuru informal settlement, now one of the largest settlements in the city, was driven in part by the Kenyan government's development of an industrial zone and the tax-free Samir Industrial Park export processing zone on the edge of the city near the airports. This is an image of some of the buildings of that export processing zone. And that area, the industrial zone, currently houses the Kenyan warehouses of international NGOs, including MSF, and leases space to manufacturers and distributors of relief supplies, and other organizations contracted by the UN and NGOs for their work both in Kenya and Nairobi settlements, but also in other areas of Africa. This is like the distribution center of the ICRC in that same industrial park. And lastly, the last theme that I wanted to touch on, this idea of politics beyond space. So the research suggested a reconsideration of the spaces of humanitarianism as representing the possibility of a politics beyond the nation state, as pointing to new spatial and political formations, governance structures, property laws, models of land tenure that respect the complex forms of ownership seen in refugee camps, in informal settlements, and other communities where no land titles exist, or where land has never been formally divided into parcels, or that lack distinctions between what is public and private space. So then these kind of settlements would not be outside the realm of politics, but rather pointing to a political community beyond the nation state, beyond property and territory. So seen in this light, humanitarian spaces like tent camps or informal settlements would not be outside politics, but emerging sites of another politics, designed not for universal humanity, reduced to its basic needs, but for a human of a political life yet to come. So this was actually, really helpful in our thinking about, the politics of humanitarian operations, in addition to the urban consequences of humanitarian operations. Being able to go to Nairobi, interviewing people in Kibera, interviewing residents of the new housing estate, people who are residents of Kibera, but also operate local NGOs, interviewing architects and urban planners who work for UN Habitat at the Gigiri compound. That really gave a lot more texture, let's say, to what would otherwise be sort of abstract ideas. So more specifically in the grant outcomes, one thing that visiting really allowed us to consider was what you could think of as the sectional qualities of what otherwise would look like boundaries in the city. So one of the findings of the book was really to reconsider Nairobi, which is often thought of as a kind of, it's often framed as a city of islands, of these compounds where wealthy areas abut extremely poor areas, and everybody moves between these kind of bounded complexes in a way that creates these very separate and distinct realities and ways of circulating through the city. But we were very interested in, other forms of connection between these otherwise seemingly bounded and separated areas. And that was something that going there really allowed us to draw out, like in this example of this underpass between Kibera and the new housing estate that is, designed to ideally sort of replace and upgrade the slum conditions of Kibera, where though they're conceived as these sort of separate and almost antithetical spatial organizations, there's a lot of traffic in between them, for commerce, for social and family relationships, et cetera. Similarly, going there allowed us to observe conditions like this. This is on the edges of Kibera, where the space between these two walls, on the left, the boundary of the settlement, on the right, this brick wall that is the edge of a wealthy golf course area, which you can see there's like shards of glass on the top. But the space between those two walls is actually one of the entrances to the settlement. So being able to observe these kind of conditions that you really wouldn't see if you were just looking at some kind of aerial view or satellite view, which is a lot of the way that our earlier research of the sites, because we hadn't been able to travel to the West Bank before the grant from Columbia, or Nairobi before the grant from the Norden Fund. So this was really, allowed us to be able to have a much more complex reading of these spaces. And then lastly, this is an image of this government-run meteorological facility that's a kind of buffer zone in between one of the informal settlements or slums and this export processing zone, where if you only looked at the map, you would think it was this kind of completely bounded, fenced-in area. But if you go there, there are all of these paths and holes in all of the fences, representing the pathways that people take through this big empty field in the middle of the city from the slum to work in the industrial processing zone. So those kind of textures and spatial organizations, alongside being able to do interviews with all of these different people working on different sides of this slum upgrading project, was really critical for our project, being able to travel there. And this is just an image from the book showing that same industrial zone that I had mentioned earlier. But also traveling, allowed us to move from that orthographic planimetric view to being able to, photograph and draw all of these different spatial forms that we encountered as we moved through these 3 sites that were part of the structure of the book. And lastly, so outcomes from the grant, obviously for us, this was conceived initially as a book project when we started in 2010, but it did actually, after 7 years of work, we were able to publish it with Berkhäuser and with support from the Graham Foundation. So this is something I wanted to mention, since this is an info session for the grant. In our experience, I know this, doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but because it was a multi-site project, it was really helpful for us to be able to break down the different constituent parts of it. And getting the funding from the Norden Fund, as I mentioned, was the first source of really external funding for the project itself. And it was just crucial, because without those 3 sites and being able to do work in those 3 sites, we really wouldn't have been able to complete the book. And then, I think the funding from the Norden Fund also helped us in seeking funding for the production of the book with the Graham Foundation. So that's something I just wanted to mention, and it may be helpful if people have questions about that in the Q&A, that being able to think about how this part of it could be funded through a travel grant with the Norden Fund, and that allowed us to actually complete the writing of the project, with an additional source of funding. And I think it's, in the interest probably of the League and the Norden Fund for these projects to have, ways of being disseminated, whether through exhibitions or publications. But that was really, really helpful for us to be able to break down the different pieces of this, what would otherwise be a very difficult and complicated project to fund on our own. So thank you so much, and feel free to email me if you have questions.
Thank you, Benedict, and thank you, Amanda. I'm Zoe Fruchter. I'm the League's program manager. And Benedict, if you don't want to be on screen for this, you can feel free to turn your camera off, because I'm going to be going through some of the basic application information for this year's call for proposals. A note to everyone, I see some people are already putting questions in the Q&A function. That is great. We will be having a Q&A after I go through these details. So please put your questions. Some of them might be answered as I go through, but please put your questions in the Q&A function and we will try to get to all of them in the question and answer section. Otherwise, you can always reach out regarding this competition to programs@archleague.org. And I think Damasi will be dropping that in the chat and you can ask further questions about your application or the competition as a whole. So in 2025, the Norden Fund will award a grant of up to $7,500 to one individual or team. The competition is open only to current full-time residents of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. However, you need not be a citizen of North American country in order to enter. There is no formal graduation year or age requirement. However, as a part of the application, and I'll get to this in a second, we do require your CV. So we take this into account as this is for students and recent graduates in the field. Preference will be given to strong proposals from applicants who have not had this sort of opportunity before, as well as students whose institutions do not provide extensive travel funding. A note, please, that applicants are not required to be enrolled in or have graduated from a professional architecture degree program such as a B-Arch or an M-Arch. And instead, what we're looking for is students or recent graduates who have demonstrated a commitment to the study of the built environment. And that can be in a variety of ways. And you can speak to that in your proposal as well as in your CV. As I said, you submit your application online. We use the platform FormStack. It's through 2 online forms. You must submit both forms in order to be considered for the prize. There's the proposal, which I'll get into, which has the most component parts, and then your recommendation letters, which are relatively straightforward. But as you heard from Linda at the beginning of the event, those are influential to the jury's decision. So for the proposal, that applicants must submit up to 3 pages, which describe the objectives of the grant request, as well as how it will contribute to their intellectual and creative development. So that's a written up to 3 pages proposal. And in addition to that written statement, you must also include the total amount that you're requesting. Again, this is up to $7,500. Please do not exceed that in terms of what you're requesting from the fund. Also a projected schedule and budget for travel and other costs, and this should be 1 page maximum. Again, all of this information is on our website, so no need to write down these exact numbers, but in giving a shape to the proposal, all of this information is necessary to complement each other. And then your resume or CV, so that's 2 pages, that should be 2 pages maximum. And these sort of additional supplemental materials do not count towards the 3-page written page limit. And if you have extra maps, images, supporting material, etc., you can include those up to 4 pages, and that does not contribute towards the page count either. The second part has its own form, and that is letters of recommendation. You must supply 2 letters of recommendation from individuals who are knowledgeable about your abilities and the project. And if you apply as a team, it's still 2 recommendations. We don't need 2 per each group member. It could be either 1 per group member or 2 recommendations that speak to your collaboration or both of you as a part of that general letter. A final note before we move to the Q&A is that the intention of the Norden Fund is to support genuinely independent projects that require travel. So grant funds cannot be used for tuition or to support participation in an organized program like a university summer abroad program. And while requests for support of dissertation research will be considered, they are not a priority of the fund. So please keep that in mind. Again, I mean, I see there's even more questions in the chat now, but please put your questions in the Q&A function, and I'm going to invite everyone back to start the Q&A.
Thank you, everyone, so much. And thank you, Zoe, for laying that out so concisely. And as Zoe said, all of this is available on the League's website, and we're all available for answers online too. Oh, you've already clicked off the ones that were answered, either Zoe or Damasi. So probably, actually, Linda, Benedict, and Amanda, you have access to the Q&A too,
I just
yes?
looked, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
So the first question that I think is germane is asking, in terms of locations that applicants travel to, has the fund shown a preference to unfamiliar regions as opposed to familiar regions that require deeper, I don't need to read the whole thing long, and they're citing an example of a place. And this has swung both ways. I know. So Linda, do you want to address that, since it's a more historic question here?
I do. Keep in mind, the fund was started in the early 90s when you didn't have the kind of digital access you now have to so many places. So it was very much about getting to places you couldn't otherwise get to. And I want to thank Amanda and Benedict, by the way. I mean, it was such a thrill to award those grants, and it's a gazillion times that much more thrilling to see what comes of them. And I could say more, but I'll say that later. I just wanted to say both of those projects really touched on boundaries and a communication across different types of understandings of a place in different communities, which I think, even if it's not explicit, is something we're partial to, we were very receptive to. I think both Amanda and Benedict had projects that did that. But in terms of travel, I have to admit that there is a perception that you want to feel that we wanted to feel that we were supporting something that you couldn't otherwise do. We don't want to just add a little more money, although that said, everything is case by case. If you're getting to a place, if the money is necessary to be able to stay for a while and really do the research you want to do in a place you're made aware of because of your understanding of a project or a field or a locale, and the grant enables you to really be there, it might fly. So it's not about distance for distance sake.
Or Western or non-Western, or
Right.
even US versus
Exactly.
any other continent, you name it, because they've been in every locale. What it does not fund is a grand tour.
No,
It does not
that's
fund coursework. It's all for independent work. But beyond that,
Grand Tour
it-
came up. That used to be a joke. And what you had said about, in terms of one of the questions that was there is what's considered a recent grant. I guess you were going to get onto that, but
Yeah,
where you
feel free.
are. Do you want me to answer that, or
Yep,
should I wait?
go ahead. You are the most experienced of all of us in all of this. So.
Well, no, but please.
And we talked about this in the organizational meeting this year. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was very much to fund that kind of what in Medicare they call the, pharmaceuticals, they call the donut hole, the demographic that doesn't get funding, where you're not still in school necessarily. It was the idea that you were either in school going out or already working, but back in school, or, some area where you're not yet likely to receive a grant or support for a project. And as I say, it's case by case. The most important thing is for you to be as passionate as Amanda and Benedict clearly were about what you're doing, and clear. And we don't expect the level of understanding they had after doing the grants or 7 years working on a book. We want to see your articulation of a possibility of a project, and the work that, why it's meaningful to you, and the research that you've done to sort of stake it out, and make it alive to us. I'll let you
Yeah, there
So,
are a
Amanda.
number of questions asking about eligibility or age. It
Yeah.
really is where you are in your career. So there's no set age limit. It's
Right.
certainly about opportunity. And again, this year when we were talking about this prize, and Linda raised it in her discussion, if you've had the opportunity to do some travel and you're building on that, that's not necessarily this year what the focus is going to be. I think the jury and the founders of the award are particularly concerned to offer this opportunity to people who haven't had it. So
Mhm.
do you need an in-depth knowledge of where you're going? No. Do you need to have some knowledge of where you're going? Yes. To have a solid proposal for why you're going there and what you're looking at.
Yes.
But it is very much about opportunity. And to reemphasize too, you do not need to have a BArch or even an undergraduate degree in architecture, a non-professional degree. You do have to have a proven interest in the built environment and understanding how it works. There are a couple questions here. One I don't have an answer to. I don't know if we've had a proposal for a construction project. I don't think this is really so much what this prize is about.
No.
And the rest
Can you,
is,
Amanda, the Ginikachi of rule on, is it a proposal for better understanding or actual solution? I would say definitely about a better understanding. We're not looking for you to provide solutions to a problem. We're looking for you to glean as fully as possible from the exposure to the actual situation and to structure the questions you're asking of it. Does that make sense? Amanda, does that make sense as an answer to that question?
I think so.
I-
And I get the question about, right, format and how much publicity there is. One thing that Linda said about we do actually, and certainly this year we'll hope for some form of some summary of what you've done, which
Mhm.
you can be creative. I don't think we've explicated, X words and whatever. It can be drawings, it can be a notebook, it can be something. And we really, as you can see, if you visited the website and see the reports, which we have for almost all years, as well as a wonderful book that was done, little book that was done after the first 10 years of portfolio designed by Mi-Jin Yoon that we have copies of here in the office. If you're local, please feel free to come and get one. But we do want to publish some form of your post-travel experience and research on our website.
I
Here's a
don't know if
question.
I could find 3 words.
Yeah, go.
I think it's about specificity of the oof, I have to think about that.
This one's for you though, so go for it. And then that's probably where we'll stop. And please, the communication lines are open. We're here to answer any questions.
I
There's
do
some-
just want to give credit. I was thanked for the Norden family, and I have to say the Norden family never had the wherewithal to support a fund like this. It was made, the idea was very much my sister's husband, Barry Magid, and who had this money from the insurance he received and used it altruistically. And then we did fundraising both for that 10th anniversary Mi-Jin Young's book and whatever. And at the beginning, for many of the colleagues my sister had and friends and well-wishers and people interested in this type of support. So I think the answer is that it's really about Benedict used the word humanitarian, that's certainly a feel about the specificity of a place, the architecture of of a very particular architecture, and the role it will play in your further developing this idea to actually be there. So travel, it is a travel grant. The role that actually meeting people, like Benedict showing the paths between these very, very different populations or structures, or Amanda showing just the incredible use made of these art projects. I know all these artists, I know Inhotim, but that's the best I've ever seen in showing how that interface between you know, a hoity-toity art area, you know, support project, and a community that didn't ask for it. You know, so those kind of, that's not 3 words, but those interfaces and exchanges, the communication, travel communication, and the architecture itself, or the community itself.
There you go. So thank you everyone for joining us. And we're really looking forward to seeing this year's proposals.
Thank you all for applying or interest.